Parashah 39. Today's Parashah stretches over a period of 38 years with 7 important points to consider, which include the death of 2 significant people. Now those 7 significant matters are, in chapter 19, the instructions about relating to the red heifer. Chapter 20 opens with Israel being turned away from Kadesh Barnea and told to head south into the Zin desert, where of course Miriam dies. Moshe and Aaron both strike the rock and are condemned to death in the wilderness along with the rest of that generation. Moshe seeks approval from the king of Edom to pass through their territory, but they refuse to give permission. Israel move on to Mount Hor, where Aaron dies and his son Eleazar takes on the mantle of Kohen Gadol, the high priest. They also destroyed the king of Arad, a Canaanite who lived in the Negev. Finally, 38 years later, that journey from Kadesh to Moab, a distance of just 600 kilometers, it took 38 years and cost the lives of all that first generation. And while all these features are all significant, I want to focus on just chapter 19, which deals only, of course, with the red heifer, because I want to see what we can learn from that chapter, particularly as it relates to us as Talmudim of Yeshua. The red heifer in chapter 19 is an interesting command that Yahweh gave Moshe while in the Zin desert, following the bad reports of the 10 spies and Korach's rebellion, which we dealt with last Shabbat. Following those bad reports and Korach's incident, the people completely lost trust in Yahweh. So Yahweh condemned them to die in the wilderness. So from that time forward, over the next 38 years, death was a constant feature of life in that community. Therefore, Yahweh deemed it necessary to establish the ritual of the red heifer as a way to cleanse people who had been in direct contact with a deceased person. Having established the primary purpose of the ritual, we need to consider 3 important features that made the heifer ritual totally unique. Firstly, the command was to slaughter and burn completely the red heifer outside of the city, away from the altar of burnt offerings, where other sacrifices were offered. Secondly, the Kohen slaughtering and burning the red heifer, by those actions he himself became ritually unclean, because in the process of touching the animal's carcass, that rendered him unclean. Thirdly, the ashes, when mixed with pure water and sprinkled on a person who had touched a dead person, rendered that individual ritually clean. The cleansing process came not from the actions of the Kohen, but from Yahweh himself. It was not the ash-water mix that caused the purification, but rather it was the obedience of the recipient who followed the command of Yahweh. By contrast, in chapter 19, verse 20, we are told how the person who does not subject himself to the sprinkling would be cut off from the community. Therefore, we see the ritual symbolized a change from death to life, which is reflected, of course, in the death and resurrection of Yeshua. The whole red heifer ritual is similar to the other commands in the Torah that require the participant to perform rituals and functions that to us in the 21st century appear a little strange and of no tangible purpose. But in all those situations, the action being taken is based on trust. Hence, through the red heifer ritual, the people being sprinkled was taken from being unclean to being ritually clean before Yahweh, simply because of his or her obedience. But put another way, that person's obedience was also a move from death to life. Was that ritual practiced throughout the Levitical era, from the time they went into Canaan until the destruction of the first temple? Or was it only applying to that first generation of Israel, who were all condemned to die in the wilderness? If we turn to the Mishnah, Parah, chapter 3, verse 5, implies that only one was prepared in the time of Moshe, and the second one was prepared by Ezra after the second temple was built. Then the sages say that there were 7 more red heifers produced throughout the time of the second temple period. That gives us a total of 9 red heifers, having been prepared throughout the period that Israel was actually in Eretz Israel. Since the development of the modern state of Israel in 1948, there has not been even one red heifer found. However, Maimonides, or Rambam, in the 13th century, made an unusual and uncharacteristic statement. The Messiah himself will prepare the 10th red heifer. Hence, for Rabbinic Judaism, the red heifer has remained possibly one of the most mysterious commands ever given in Torah. But as we know, when the Mashiach, Yeshua, comes, all the mysteries will be revealed, and he will teach the inner secrets of Torah. The words of Maimonides concerning the 10th red heifer also suggest that Rabbinical Judaism know that the red heifer ritual as being something of the past. Also, it points forward to a time when their knowledge of God will be finally revealed in its entirety. But as we know, as Talmudim of Yeshua, that will not occur until it is revealed by Yeshua himself after his second coming. So until then, without knowing Yeshua, the significance of the red heifer remains a constant mystery to Rabbinical Judaism. So what about the modern sages? For example, Nechemah Lebowitz, a well-respected 20th century biblical teacher and scholar, said, "The chapter on the red heifer with which this parashah begins is one of the most mystifying in Torah. Our sages observed that it was one of the matters which even the wisest men failed to fathom." She also quotes from one of the ancient sages by saying, "Rabbi Isaac pondered the words spoken by King Solomon, who was credited as being the wisest man who ever lived. And he stated, 'All this I have put to the test of wisdom. I said, I will acquire wisdom, but wisdom remains far from me.'" Others have adopted a more allegorical and homiletic approach. For example, the extract from the medieval Italian Rabbi Schifano in the 16th century says, "The crux of the mystery is that its ability to contaminate the pure and to purify the contaminated." That is the mystery. Schifano continues, "Perhaps we must catch a little of the significance in our attempt to understand the observance, when we consider one of the fundamental requirements is that the red heifer had to be completely red. The prophet has explained that this is because sin is described as being red. Though our sins are scarlet, they shall be made as white as snow," from Isaiah chapter 1 verse 18. Now, many other rabbinic explanations have been offered, but these 3 illustrate that Judaism has never fully understood the significance behind the ashes of the red heifer. So what about Christendom? What do they make of this mystery? If we look at the New Advent Catholic Encyclopedia, it addresses the ashes in a vague way. Their quote says, "It is not easy to arrive at the fundamental reason for the liturgical use of the ashes. No doubt our Christian rituals have been borrowed from the practice of the Jews, a practice retained in certain details of the synagogue ceremony even today. A number of passages in the Old Testament connect ashes with mourning, and we are told that the mourner sat or rolled in or even sprinkled on his head or even mingled with food the ashes. The main foundation for this suggestion is that the rite of the red heifer in Numbers, in which the ashes of the victim had a ceremonial efficacy in purifying the unclean. From this reference, we see that the Catholic Church places little or no real significance on the red heifer. So what about the Protestant Church? Many in the end-time prophecy movement draw considerable attention to the red heifer as the final step before the third temple will be built in Jerusalem. Most predicate this reasoning on the belief that one blemish-free red heifer will be found and the third temple will be built. Such people are convinced that such a heifer will be found and the temple will be built before Yeshua returns. But try as we may, we can find nothing in Scripture that suggests the third temple will be built before Yeshua returns. Finally, what about the Messianic community? What does the red heifer ritual mean to us as Talmidim of Yeshua? In spite of the red heifer being basically set aside as an unsolvable mystery by both the Jewish and the Christian communities, from a scriptural perspective, it remains an important matter, because Moshe was told in chapter 19, verse 21, this is a permanent regulation for them, meaning that Israel had to observe this all through all generations. Therefore, as Talmidim of Yeshua, the provision in the red heifer narrative is still just as applicable as it was when it was given to Moshe. However, as Talmidim of Yeshua, it is important to consider the whole narrative in context with the death, resurrection, and return of Yeshua. As the command was given long before Yeshua spoke during his earthly ministry, the question must be asked, how can it be related to his death and resurrection? One example where it applied was in the writings of Yochanan, John, chapter 9, verse 38 to 42, where two men, Yosef and Nicodemus, who together took Yeshua's body down from the stake and placed him in the tomb, both touched the body and became ritually unclean for a full 7 days. Yet it must be remembered that it was just about sundown on the 14th day of Aviv, and there was no way that those two men could partake of the Pesach Seder that night, nor could they assemble with the rest of the community during the week of Matzah. By laying Yeshua's body in the tomb, they were fulfilling the words spoken about earlier in that chapter in verse 31, where, because it was preparation day for Pesach, the Judeans wanted the body removed from the stake before sundown, in accordance with the mitzvah of Devarim, or Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verse 22 to 23. If someone has committed a capital crime and is put to death, then hung on a tree, his body is not to remain overnight on the tree, but you must bury him that same day, because a person who has been hanged on a tree has been cursed by God, so that you will not defile your land, which Yahweh your God has given you to inherit. So we see from this one example that the commands given to Moshe were still being followed by the authorities in the first century of Israel. Therefore, by taking Yeshua's body down from the stake and laying him in the tomb, both Yosef and Nectamon rendered themselves ritually unclean. Luke's account in chapter 23 verses 50 and 51 also speaks about Joseph being a righteous person, a Zadik. He was also a member of the Sanhedrin. Even though he was part of the Sanhedrin, he was not in agreement with their motives and actions that led to the trial and execution of Yeshua, which is why he took it upon himself to make himself ritually unclean by laying the body of Yeshua to rest. Hence, he had to wait until the second month in accordance with the Torah before he could eat Pesach. But all four Gospels are silent on whether or not he was sprinkled with the water of purification on the third and seventh days after his contact with Yeshua's body. But as a Torah observant Zadik, it is most likely that he was sprinkled. The Torah relates events surrounding Yeshua's death are not covered in the four Gospels, and the matter concerning the person either being clean or unclean appears to have passed over as being of little importance. What about the ritual cleansing? As we read in Numbers chapter 19, the person who touched the corpse had to undergo purification process in 2 stages, on the 3rd day and the 7th. Then only at the evening of the 7th day did that person return and become ritually clean. So what is the significance of that 3rd and 7th days? Torah does not give any answer, which is why most people have tended to ignore the ritual process. However, we must ask, is there a larger or greater fulfillment? As Moshe was told, and it was a permanent ritual, it seems logical that there must be a greater fulfillment where Yahweh will deal with both Israel and the rest of humanity in the Olam Haba, the age to come. Taking a wider look at the sovereign plan of God, we know that God rested from his creative works at the end of the 6th creative day, and Adam and Hava were meant to live in a constant relationship with Yahweh God while dwelling in Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. It was when they broke God's first command by eating the forbidden fruit that they were thrown out of the garden and their relationship with Yahweh was destroyed. Hence, that relationship will not be restored in its entirety until after the final judgment spoken about in Revelation. Then, as we see in Revelation chapter 2, verse 7, to him winning the victory, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in God's Gan Eden. However, that return to Gan Eden will not occur until sometime in the 8th millennium, following Yeshua's 1,000-year reign of restoration. Therefore, just as a corpse unclean person in ancient Israel could not return to the camp until the evening or the end of the day, the 7th day also mankind will not be restored to Gan Eden until all the 7th creative days of God have passed. So when we compare the cleansing of the corpse unclean person in accordance with the rituals of the Red Heifer, we see that even though the person was sprinkled on the 3rd day, he or she remained unclean until the evening of the 7th day. Only then were they permitted to go back into the camp and were considered ritually clean. When we consider how the sprinkling of the ash water mix on the 3rd and 7th days applied to the people of Israel while they were still in the wilderness, we see also that there is a greater application. It appears to be speaking about the 3rd and 7th millennium of God's creative rest period. The 3rd millennium of God's rest began around the time when Abraham was called to go to the land of Canaan. That was when Yahweh cut the covenant by walking between the animals with the fire pot and the flaming torch, and made his covenant promise to Abraham that Eretz Israel, as the promised land, would become the permanent inheritance of Abraham's descendants, but only through the line of Yitzhak, that's Isaac, and Yaakov, Jacob. That promise was made near the beginning of the third day, or the millennium. That was the first stage of the two-stage process. The second stage, which is yet to occur, will be the restoration of all Israel back to their land of inheritance during the seventh millennium, which will only be fulfilled after the return of Yeshua. Then he will cleanse Israel from past transgressions and make them ritually clean in his sight. They will finally be made clean for eternity. However, those who refuse to accept Yeshua and his cleansing during that period will be destroyed. Just as Moshe warned in Bamidbar 19 verses 13 and 20, everyone who touches a corpse, no matter whose dead body it may be, and does not purify himself, that person will be cut off from Israel, because the water of purification was not sprinkled on him. Hence, the mitzvah, as applied to the red heifer, have remained a mystery to rabbinical Judaism, simply because they failed to acknowledge that Yeshua was their promised Mashiach, or Messiah. In a similar manner, the churches of Christendom, by setting aside the Torah as having been replaced through the death and resurrection of Yeshua, have also failed to see and embrace the full significance of the red heifer narrative. I believe the key to the greater application of the red heifer is expressed in Yochanan chapter 12 verses 44 through 50, when Yeshua made himself available to all Israel through the sovereign plan of God. Particularly in verse 44 he says, "To those who put their trust in me are trusting not only me, but also the one who sent me." Then in verse 48, "Those who reject me and don't do what I say have a judge, the word which I have spoken, that will judge them on the last day." So what is the word which Yeshua is alluding to? It must be the same word that he revealed to that first generation of Israel through Moshe while they were still in the wilderness. They were the same ones who at that time had failed to trust the leadership provided through Moshe. We must also keep in mind what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 1 to 5, where he said, "For brothers, I don't want you to miss the significance of what happened to our fathers. All of them were guided by the pillar of cloud, and they passed through the sea. And in connection with the cloud and with the sea, they all immersed themselves into Moshe. Also, they ate the same food from the Spirit. They all drank the same drink from the Spirit. For they drank from the Spirit-sent rock, which followed them, and the rock was the Messiah. Yet with the majority of them, God was not pleased, and their bodies were strewn all over the desert." All those things were manifestations of Yeshua that were given to the people of that first generation. But Israel failed, both in the wilderness and in the first century, by not realizing that Yeshua was their long-awaited Messiah, the one who had been with them all the time. So the death and resurrection of Yeshua had a profound effect on how the red heifer would impact in the Olam Haba, because through the death and resurrection of Yeshua, the red heifer rituals will be brought to completion, but not until after his return. After his resurrection, Yeshua could not remain among his people in Eretz Israel. He had to go and sit at the right hand of his Father, because through his sacrificial death, he took upon himself the death of all mankind. And through that action, he became separated, or unclean, and he had to remain apart from his own people for 3 days. While he was separated for 3 literal days in the tomb, he was also separated, has also been separated from them and rejected by Israel for 2 millennium. Only in the 3rd millennium will he build the 3rd temple on earth. Only in that same 3rd millennium will Israel finally recognize him as the long-awaited Messiah. As a consequence of all that, I believe that Shaul was also grappling with these same matters when he spoke in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 11 through 15, where he said, "The Kohen Hagadol brings the blood of animals into the holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned up outside the camp. So too Yeshua suffered death outside the gate, in order to make people holy through his own blood. Therefore, let us go out to him who is outside the camp, and share in his disgrace. For we have no permanent city here. On the contrary, we seek the one yet to come." Reflecting back on those verses, looking first at verse 11, Shaul is considering the ancient Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial rituals. Then he moves on to consider the deep significance of Yeshua's own death in verse 12, where his own blood was shed outside the city gate, just like the red heifer was sacrificed outside the city gate to make the people holy and ritually clean again. He then moves on in verse 13 to turn his attention to us, saying, "Let us go out to him who is outside the camp and share in his, Yeshua's, disgrace." Then finally in verse 14, he reminds us that we have no permanent city here. On the contrary, we seek the one that is yet to come. There are deep truths that Shaul is bringing to the attention of his Corinthian audience. They are things that are just as applicable in today's world. So we need to ponder those words carefully, because we are awaiting the upward call from our Master Yeshua to be taken into the heavenly Yerushalayim as his Kohanim. All mankind will be cleansed by the water of purification, so that they can once again have access to the tree of life in Gan Eden. However, reflecting again on what Moshe said in Bamidbar 19 verse 13, anyone who touches a corpse and does not purify himself will be cut off from Israel, because the water of purification was not sprinkled on him. Such a person, whether from Israel or from any other nation, who refuses to be purified by Yeshua and his Kohanim during the 1,000 years, will be making a free will choice to be cut off eternally. So in conclusion, we have seen how Yahweh made provision for all the people of that first generation of Israel to be made ritually clean in his presence while their generation passed through the wilderness. We have also seen that the water of purification was to be a permanent regulation. There has been no red heifer prepared since the destruction of the Second Temple. So we can see, rest assured, that the ritual will be restored in the Olam Haba. Then during the restoration of all mankind, they will be given the opportunity to be purified by Yeshua in his 1,000-year reign, which will occur, of course, in the third day, or millennium, after his sacrificial death, which will also be the seventh creative day, or millennium, since Adam and Hava were removed from Gan Eden. Finally, on the eighth creative day, or the eighth millennium, all mankind who have allowed themselves to be purified will be given access to the tree of life and restored in Gan Eden. Shabbat Shalom.